I am here to say that I have failed you as a book reviewer. I always say that it's my responsibility to find all the new books, to read all the new books, and then tell you which ones are worth your time and which ones to skip over. And so every year at the end, I do a video, or several videos actually, talking about all my favorites for the year. And unfortunately, apparently I missed not just one, but two fantastic horror books that came out last year that I should have read and reviewed and told you all to read. And I didn't. They fell completely off my radar, and I made a top 10 list that definitely should have included these two books. So I'm here to remedy that, talk about them as almost new releases, as well as some actual new releases, because I don't want to do that again this year, so I'm going to read everything. Well, not everything, but everything that sounds good at least. If that sounds good, let's get started. Now, I should probably start with the books I missed. The first one is Bloom by Delilah Dawson, and this is a short novella that follows a woman who, at the beginning of the story, goes to the farmer's market and meets or sees this beautiful woman who is selling these handmade products of soap and other things along the way, and she becomes immediately attracted to her. She becomes, well, obsessed, and then we follow their story as they continue, and there is a bit of a romance aspect to the story, a sapphic one, as you can understand. And within the story, again, while it has a romance element to it, you know it's in the horror genre, and so it leans into the dark and sinister nature of obsession, especially in love, and it just goes down that dark rabbit hole that I really love. I love that focus on female intents, whether it be friendships or something romantic. Just the obsession that comes with that I always think is great, because there's so much to do and play around with when it comes to female toxic relationships of any kind, and the writing within the story is beautiful. I really like the style. I've come to more appreciate prose in the last few years, and so when I do read a story that has really elegant writing, not in a purpley way or anything distracting, but just simply tightly written with really thoughtful language, it really draws me in. And as I mentioned, this is a novella, which is something you've noticed in horror I tend to really like. I feel like an author who writes a shorter story has less opportunity to go off the wayside, to wander into something that I don't enjoy in a story. Instead, everything feels very purposeful, very tightly written. I was able to read this very quickly in just under 24 hours, and I love this one. It's one that, had I had the opportunity to sit and read the whole thing, I definitely could have done it. It held my attention from start to end. And if you love that kind of cozier horror where it has this kind of familiarity to it, and then you know that there is dark layers underneath, this is the kind of story I recommend to readers who love things that are a little bit more subtle until they're not. Then the other book that fell through the cracks in 2023 was Apparitions by Pottle, and this is another horror story. This one is set in Canada, which of course always appeals to me. We follow a young, nameless, deaf individual, a young boy who escapes from the grasp of his father, who essentially has held him as a prisoner, and then he runs off and ends up stumbling into a psychiatric care facility where he meets another boy who also happens to be deaf. Through meeting him, he learns sign language and then begins to communicate. And so the story unravels from there. This is one that is horror in a degree, but also very much a character study. I think people who enjoy things like Room by Emma Donoghue will really enjoy this one as well, where it very much explores what happens when someone is kept in that kind of condition or environment. So we have someone who is really coming to understand the world really for the first time. They were very young when they were taken, and so you have them not really understand things. And so there's some really beautiful or interesting ways that the author imagines someone not understanding things that we otherwise take for granted. We also have the representation of a deaf person, or actually two, which I can't, of course, personally speak to that experience, but from an outside perspective, it certainly seemed to be very thoughtful and nuanced. I like the fact that the two boys were not the same and didn't feel like they were just filling a stereotype, and instead kind of exploring some of the differences and just learning more about sign language and how it is communicated and so forth. I found to be very interesting. I always say that while I read for fiction, I read for fun. I also enjoy when I learn something, even if it's something a little bit more nuanced than just straight up hard science fiction facts. If I can get a better understanding of someone who is different than me or something like that, I find I'm much more attached to a story if I find myself learning as I go. And so overall, I really enjoyed this one. I thought the character work was fantastic. There was kind of a good element of mystery and solving and kind of working your way through. The actual backstory to this one character is quite horrific. And again, this is a younger boy, so keep that in mind for anyone who finds that kind of content involving young protagonists and harm to be troubling. This one definitely hits hard in certain places. I enjoy a book that is a little bit punchy. Not everyone does. My only personal criticism is something just specific to me, and that's the fact that this book is written in a very loose multimedia format, so that not necessarily any pictures, it doesn't have that, but instead there are different kind of segments and passages that are not written in a traditional novel form. For some people, they love it. I am someone, maybe I'm a little bit basic, but I actually just prefer novels written as novels. I find it a little bit jarring or off-putting to have to kind of pivot and read something that's not part of the main text. And so I didn't love that aspect, but I know I think in the minority there. I think, let me know down below, but I'm pretty sure most of you love when there's little letters and segments and stories. And for me, I just like the story self-contained. But again, all of that did was keep it from being a 5-star read, but it was a really strong 4-star read. Definitely want to recommend, definitely an author I'd read more by. Now let's switch gears and talk about some new releases, starting with The Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones. This is the 3rd book in the trilogy that started with My Heart is a Chainsaw. And this, of course, this whole series follows a young protagonist named Jade, and she is living on reserve, and possibly there is a slasher happening. There are very much layers to the story, and I don't want to spoil book 3 or spoil any of the events leading up to it by talking about that synopsis. But if you're not familiar, this young woman has a challenging home life. There's definitely a conversation around some of the dynamics of living on reserve or being Indigenous in the United States. And so you have that built into the story. And then on top of that, you also have her deep-seated love for slasher films. And so I do need to mention that the character in books will generally spoil or hint at some of the major plot twists in some of the major slasher movies, but as long as you're semi up on pop culture, none of these should be a surprise. I think you know who is behind the Halloween franchise and so forth, so I encourage you to kind of be aware that they are going to talk about those films. So it's more of a case that if you're familiar with the stories, you will hopefully be more immersed in the story and it will add more to your reading experience, but it's less so really spoiling anything, but giving you more context and kind of, giving you those little nuggets, those little hints throughout the story. At least in this one, there's mentions of, movies that previously had different names and just different fun facts that I feel like anyone who is a horror buff will just enjoy geeking out with the character. If you enjoyed the first 2 books in the series, I definitely recommend continuing on. This is very much a case where this one is consistent with the first 2 books. And I think if you just love spending time with Jade, she's very much at the center of this one. And I think that it's just a solid finish. So again, if you really love the beginning, I think you'll be very happy with where it goes. Next, let's talk about Wayward by Emily Hart. And this is one that I received from the publisher for review. And this is a story that is told over 3 different perspectives, over 3 different timelines. We have the semi-present day, so 2019. I'm noticing a lot of things aren't written after 2020, or set rather. And so within the story, we follow a woman who is going and fleeing off to her family cottage. We also have a perspective set in the 1600s, where someone is accused of a murder and possibly has a witchy background. And then we have another perspective set in World War II. And so it follows 3 women who have witchy backgrounds and families, potentially have magic, and that is woven into the story. So this is one that I would absolutely recommend to my friends, and I know who some of them are, that love witchy stories. They just love any story involving witches, particularly the female-focused kind. And this one is very feminist. It explores these different narratives and they slowly tie together in a way that I think can be very satisfying for someone looking for that kind of read. I thought the characters were all reasonably interesting and so forth. This is a story that is not entirely for me. I really was attracted and wanted to try this one out based off the great reviews I had heard, and I appreciate it, but simply witchy fiction for itself is not my favorite aspect of horror. I just find that it never leans into the horror aspects the way I would like to. Again, I love that it tends to be very female-centric and very much putting women in places of power and all of that. Love what it's doing, but it's not the kind of book that's going to get a 5-star read from me. But again, if you have not read this witchy book, I do think this is one you want to check out. I thought it was fantastic for those readers. I just wish I was one of them. Next is A Botanical Garden by Noah Medlock, and this is a book that follows 2 gay men who are in a relationship. However, in the time that this book is set, that is very much frowned upon, so they kind of hide away their relationship by living in this garden space out of the way. They both have their eccentric hobbies. So the one is a taxidermist, and then the the other one loves breeding and growing exotic plants, and you slowly follow them as their hobbies come together and the story goes from there. This is a great example of queer horror that really ties in the social commentary into the horror aspects to it. If you're someone who loves horror involving plants and kind of organic life, this one also leans into that as well. This is again one where I very much appreciate it. I read it and think I know certain people who will adore this book. It wasn't quite a favorite of mine, and so I very much want to kind of segment that I can appreciate a book being for someone else. I think that this book is doing a lot of things right. I thought the writing was great. The character work was fairly well done. I wasn't as attached to the male characters as I wanted to be, but I also don't have that emotional connection perhaps of being, say, a male reader who is gay looking for that representation. So I have friends that I think would enjoy this one a little bit more on that extra level that I don't have. And so I like this one. If anything, my biggest complaint, or the reason it didn't entirely work for me, is I did find it more slow paced. It takes a while before you get into the creepy elements, and so it's much more that subtle horror, that slow horror, which sometimes works for me, again, if I'm really attached to the characters and just want to spend time with them. That can work, and certainly has in other books. But because I found the characters to be good, but not grabbing my attention the same way, I was kind of waiting for something to happen, and it took longer than I would have liked for that thing to happen. If you're immersed from the first page, if you just want to spend time with the characters and their weird hobbies and their forbidden love, then you'll likely adore this book, and I know people do. So I do recommend it, again, to the right audience. That unfortunately, again, wasn't quite me. Next is Where Sleeping Girls Lie, which is written by the same author who wrote Ace of Spades. This is another YA thriller. This one came out this year. I love the author's previous work, which was basically a Gossip Girl retelling a TV show that was definitely a guilty pleasure when it came out, but one that I still nostalgically enjoy for what it was, and so I was eager to read whatever the author did next. This one definitely has a similar plot or setup to a degree. We follow a young girl who was previously homeschooled and then goes off to a boarding school for the first time. The story starts out, of course, with all the usual tropes. You have the mean girls trying to fit in with the other characters, figuring out classes and so forth. And then within the story, and it's right on the back of the book, so it's not a surprise, there is someone found dead, and then the main character has to try to sort out who is behind this murder of a student, and the story goes from there and really goes into high gear. This is one that started out really slowly. Had I not received a digital copy for review, had I not loved the author's first book, honestly, if I was reading this by myself, just simply from the library, I would have been tempted to put the book down, but I was interested enough to keep going based off those facts, and I'm glad I did, because this is one that just took a long time to get going. I didn't find it had the same hook of Ace of Spades. With that one, you get going really quickly, and there's some really juicy details that make you want to keep reading. This one really makes you wait, and again, it perhaps feels a little bit more predictable, even though that one was basically a retelling of a TV show. But for whatever reason, this one just didn't fully grab my attention for probably at least 2/3 of the book, which is pretty harsh to say. So for some people, that'll be a no-go. I completely understand. And I do it too, where I don't love pitching a book saying, hey, this book becomes great, you just have to wait for it. However, this book does become great, you just have to wait for it. Essentially, by the end, there's some really high stakes, there are some big reveals, and it gets very dark. I'll say tonally, some of the reveals about what is happening at this school, at least in my memory of what happened in Ace of Spades, nothing quite to this level happened there, or at least nothing quite as serious. And so I wouldn't call this book as fun as that one. I think it deals more heavily with real social issues that happen in these boarding schools, these hot pockets of intense, bullying and just the terrible things that people do to each other. So if you enjoy stories like that really dive into the darkness of peer relationships, of the awful things that happen to young people when people choose to prey on them, this book goes there, and I wasn't expecting it to go that dark. Again, I thought it would be a little bit more light and fluffy, which is more how I felt about Ace of Spades. This one went dark, but if you know my channel, if you know my taste, I tend to enjoy that, so that was not a turn off for me. Once it got going, I just flew through the last section of this book. It's definitely a book I'm now interested in rereading, despite my middling review of the first parts of the book. I am now much more invested because I know where it goes, but again, your mileage may vary depending on if you're someone who enjoys a punchy ending or need the story to be fast-paced and furious the whole time through. So I really enjoyed this one. In the end, I ended up having really warm feelings about it, but I also recognize that I nearly dropped the book, so keep that in mind if you decide to pick it up, and I'd love to know if you have read it, how your opinion compares to mine. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And again, let me know any 2024 releases, whether it be horror, thrillers, or other dark things that you want me to read and review. I do not want to miss a single book this year, or at least I don't want to miss anything that could be a potential favorite. So I got to do my homework, I got to do my research, and if you want to help me out with that, I appreciate it. If you're new to my channel and do want to stick around, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a big thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji, lets me know you're here. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.